Greetings, gamers. It's Tim here again, and I want to discuss obscure games. This is part 2 of my obscure games thing. It may not be very long because I kind of want to stick to one game each conversation that we have, so to speak. If you want to reply to this, please do so we can have more of a back and forth kind of thing. I wanted to discuss this game today, however, called Sun and Storm. Published in 1993 by Storm Press and written by D. Pilurs, P-I-L-U-R-S. I have no idea if this person or group of people have written other things over the years, but I was a little interested in this game when it first came out. It presents, basically, it calls itself the dark fantasy role-playing game. That wasn't a big thing in the 90s. We were just getting things like Vampire and Werewolf and a little bit of others. I mean, there have been a lot of games over the years. But dark fantasy beyond Warhammer was not quite a catch. This game, however, has a more of a post-apocalyptic feel. Because at one point, they were a space-faring race who flew in dragon-shaped ships, magically empowered. They use guns that are powered by magic. They have cars that are flying cars that are powered by magic. But most of that's been lost in the invasion of these undead creatures called the Cretitempec. Now, player characters come from one of three races: the Hadaborians, the Rehesek, or the Kehesek. The Rehesek and the Kehesek are related, one being basically the warrior version of the race, and the other one being the artificer magicians of the race. And that's where the game kind of failed, I think, because you have three races, and each of them pretty much are wired to a very specific set of abilities, which makes them a racial class. And people like flexibility, especially when you have 5 players wanting to make characters. Nobody usually wants to make a character just like somebody else. And while this game allows you to adjust your scores and certain other things, it's still going to have a similar ability set similar to the other members of the party if they're the same race. And that really limits you to 3 character archetypes. And that's not a good thing when you talk about a game. Now, the world is fairly sparse, but it is rather interesting. As I said, it's a dark fantasy, post-apocalyptic kind of setting in which they once had this vast level of technology that has fallen away in their fight, and they are driven back by these undead things. And the problem is they keep spreading. The undead things just keep taking over and capturing more people and making more Cretitempec and on and on and on. A very zombie apocalypse thing. But without them being zombies. They're not necessarily stupid. They can use weapons and armor. So they're basically just an evil, dark version, undead version of a potential player character. But none of it really caught me. The setting, the system didn't really grab me. The system's kind of a hodgepodge of different ideas. It does have some neat parts. For example, you can make a character who's an incredibly powerful wizard with little control. The fallout of that is if your wizard character releases a lot of power, can't control it, he's going to take the fallout from that. And that may mean, oh, I blow up a city, but I also blow up me and all my friends within the same radius as the city as fallout. Now, what really impressed me about the game was it didn't take itself too seriously, despite being a dark fantasy setting. And that's become an issue of late, because in one of the places I go, there's a person who seems to think that the only way you can make a dark game is to make sure everybody, players and characters alike, are miserable. I don't think that's true. I think any dark fantasy setting only works in a contrast with humor and hope. Otherwise, why play? Why play something so dark and miserable? You're not going to get a whole lot out of it in the long run. Now, there are people who disagree with me, and that's fine. But what really got me about this is when presenting the rules, they talk to you sort of in character, explaining the rules to characters in the book in their sidebars. It's actually quite funny. It makes for an interesting read and means even though these are fairly small rule books, they go by like that in terms of reading them. Now, should there be a new edition of this game? I can't say? It had neat ideas. It really would have needed a lot of work, rules, system wise, and probably setting wise to make something more playable to modern gamers. I mean, it is over 20 years old at this point, slightly, and it didn't have a lot of draw, even when it first came out. It's an obscure game, and it's obscure for a reason. It didn't even have much of a following, as I understand it. People, there may be 2 or 3 people other than me who has it, or maybe 20, or who knows. So if you've read this book and have any thoughts, good or bad, about it, share them with me. I'd be welcome to take a look at them, and we can discuss it and have a real conversation here. The art is not very good. It's about standard for amateur artists of the time period, which I can't really complain about because that's not a whole lot more advanced or terrible than any other game of the time period, other than the ones that had real money and real art directors. And even then, we're talking things like Dungeons and Dragons, second edition, and the like. You know, big companies with a lot of money to pour into them. GDW, he did Warhammer. The art's probably comparable to more of the smaller offerings that were out at the time, like R. Talsorian's Cyberpunk or even Shadowrun of the time, which I admit I like the look of a lot of Shadowrun's art, even in that time period. But it has improved. We've gotten better art most of the time over the years. We've lost some good art too, and the artists behind them. But that happens, especially over 20 years or however long it's actually been since most of those games were fresh and new. I know that Cyberpunk came out in 88, 89. I can't remember. Don't quote me on that. It's been a while. But part of the reason I wanted to do this series is to point out some interesting small games that don't have a following, don't have anybody still talking about them, as opposed to the ones I really love, really adore, which tend to have a shared love. Games like Talislanta and Marvel Superheroes Phase Rip still have a fairly huge following, despite the fact that they're not really in print anymore. And while this one was pretty much forgotten, and likely for good reasons. So I welcome you to take a look, to give me feedback, to discuss things. There's some other games I wish I had, for example, that I could take a look at, like Dark Earth Legends, which was also a dark fantasy role-playing game that came back out in the past, that was pretty much kind of what you get if you took a little bit of Lovecraft and smacked it onto Tolkien back in the day. But I no longer have those books. I've given them away because I wasn't using them. And so I can't really, share them with you beyond mentioning they exist, they're out there. You might be able to find one in a hobby shop half-price bin or something like that. Anyway, thanks for sharing this time with me. Take care. Good gaming.